Hi, I'm Alex Jules, and you're watching Atheist Edge.
Hey everyone, welcome back to Atheist Edge. I am Chris, and once again, we are performing a public service by reading apologetics books so you don't have to. Recently, we read, for our Atheist Christian Book Club, we read Stealing from God by Dr. Frank Turek. Dr. Turek is the president of crossexamine.org, which is an apologetics ministry dedicated to teaching people, students, etc., how to talk to people like us. And according to this book, the whole thesis of it is that there are so many arguments that atheists make that can be turned back around and show just how much they actually need God to make those arguments. So it was an interesting read in that regard. And I do want to give, before I dig into it, I do want to give credit where credit's due real quick. We did have Dr. Turek come to speak to our book club when he was in town, and he didn't have to do that. We were his third engagement of a day. He came to us straight from his second engagement, and he didn't have to do that. He could have gone, had a nice dinner, and gotten a good night's sleep, and instead he came to talk to us and field our questions, and I do want to give props to him for doing that. We really enjoyed having him out. We do need to address his arguments, because by virtue of running an apologetics ministry, the stuff that he's telling people will eventually come back to them trying to talk to us. And so it's good to understand the kinds of things that he thinks atheists need to hear, and that he's telling people to tell atheists. And a lot of it is stuff you may have heard before, just because you may be talking with people who have gone through his programs or read his books or heard his speeches. So as opposed to previous book reviews that we've done, we're not going to be quite as specific in this one, but instead we're going to try and hit some trends here, talk about the kinds of arguments that he makes and the problems with them. And hopefully that will help prepare you to help address those same kind of arguments you may be dealing with in your regular life, talking with family, friends, random people on the street. So let's get started. Problem number one: sometimes atheism is just atheism. Dr. Turek really wants to argue against atheism in this book, but if you're like a lot of us and atheism to you is just, I don't believe in God, that's a hard argument or it's a hard position to really argue against, because it's just saying, I don't believe your arguments. So in order to have a book to write, Dr. Turek has to reframe atheism to include a whole bunch of other isms that he can argue against. For example, right from the very beginning, in the introduction, Turek says this: atheists affirm the positive belief that atheistic materialism is the best way to explain ultimate reality. And so, right again, there are two different things we're talking about here. One, atheism is about, I do believe in God, I don't believe in God. Materialism is about, I believe material things are all that exist, or I believe that there are other things that are immaterial. And to be sure, there's a lot of overlap there, but for one thing, that's not always true of all atheists. There are atheists that believe in ghosts. There are atheists that believe in, there's a spiritual but not religious type of people who may or may not call themselves atheists. In our group, we have people who don't believe in God but do believe in other kinds of woo and weirdness and immaterial spirituality. So right off the bat, Turek isn't speaking to atheists, he's speaking to a caricature of atheists. And he actually specifically says that his goal is to reframe the debate here. Also in the intro, he says this: atheists must make a positive case that only material things exist. We don't. That's why instead of debating, does God exist, I prefer to debate the question, what better explains reality, atheism or theism? Then it's obvious that both debaters have the burden of proof to support this position. Well, keeping that keep that phrase in mind, what better explains reality, because we're going to get back to it pretty soon. But, Turek's trying to reframe the debate here, and you don't have to have his debate. If he's, or someone who's following him is trying to reframe the debate to make it easier on them, you don't have to go their way. You can point out where they're wrong already, and you can debate your actual position, not what they think your debate position should be. But moving on, he also conflates atheism with determinism. He says, for materialists, which all atheists are, of course, the laws of physics determine everything we think and do. If that's the case, if we are mere meat machines without free will, then we have no justification to believe anything that we think, including any thought that atheism is true. As meat machines completely determined by the laws of physics, we cannot reason, we can only react. So we could do a whole video, probably several videos about the free will debate. I'm not in a position to say that I've settled that issue for myself personally, but once again, not all atheists are determinists. There are atheists who would support compatibilism and say that the laws of physics are compatible with free will. And if you're one of them, then once again, you don't need to have a debate based on what Turek thinks your position is. If this position is, once again, not all atheists, and it shouldn't be, he shouldn't be burdening all atheists with a position that they don't hold. It gets worse. He has a lot to talk about meaning, and he asserts that all atheists must necessarily be gloomy, doomy nihilists. In his chapter on meaning, he says, on an atheistic worldview, we're nothing but overgrown germs that arrived here accidentally by mindless processes, and thus have no ultimate purpose or significance. Life is meaningless. We are objectively worth zero. And this is another thing we're going to get back to a little bit later, but not all atheists are nihilists. Many atheists would assert that they live fulfilling, meaningful lives, even if they're not eternal lives. And to have Turek caricature atheists in such a way is very disappointing. And last, atheism is not postmodernism. And I always hear this talked about, like, conflated with atheist university campuses trying to lead your children astray. And I didn't go to a secular university, so I don't know if this is actually a thing, but that would be a reason, once again, I didn't have a postmodern education. I am not a postmodernist. Don't lump your postmodernism on me as an atheist. But he's trained people to talk to us, and he says, when someone says there is no truth, ask that person, is that true? Saying there is no truth is like saying I can't speak a word of English, or my parents had no kids that lived, or everything I say is a lie. So that's all well and good, but I don't say that. I don't know any atheists that do say that. I'm sure there are some out there, but theists, if you're watching this, make sure you understand the position of the person you're talking to before you start adding extra beliefs that they haven't asserted. Don't go assume materialism. Don't go assuming determinism or nihilism or postmodernism. That's not how you engage in honest debate. Moving on, problem number 2. Any explanation is better than no explanation. So getting back to the first part, why does Turek want to reframe the debate to say what better explains reality? Well, that's because he has this idea of an all-powerful God that, of course, it explains everything. An all-powerful God just does that. It doesn't mean that God exists. It just means that you've invented a way for yourself to stop questioning things. And he does this a lot throughout the book. He loves the phrase inference to best explanation. Right? For example, he quotes John Lennox in a debate he had with Richard Dawkins. And he has Lennox saying, and I ask myself, as an inference to the best explanation, which makes more sense? That there is an eternal logos and that the universe, its laws, and the capacity for mathematical description, and so on are derivative, including the human mind, from the logos, that makes very much more sense to me as a scientist than if it's the other way around, especially when there is no explanation for the existence of the universe. He makes this big deal about theism having an answer to it all, but the best answer that you have right now may not actually be the right answer. You just may not have enough information to get to the right answer. Like when you're a kid, the tooth fairy is a really compelling explanation for how teeth get taken out from under your pillow and replaced with money. And that stands until you actually catch your parents in the act, because you now receive new information that makes you realize that your supernatural explanation, the best explanation at the time, is not actually right. And he keeps going on about that, how theism has all these explanations for things that atheism doesn't. And when he talks about reason, he says that your mind is what makes you a conscious agent with the ability to make choices and intentionally direct yourself to an end. There's no way atheism and materialism could ever explain that, but theism can and does. Or the laws of logic, for instance. He says, all I'm saying at this point is that some kind of theism explains the laws of logic, but atheism certainly does not. Everything can't be reduced to materials. So if you're an atheist, I know what you're thinking. He's just making God of the gaps arguments all the time. And you think that, except Turek says he's not. Therefore he's not. He keeps making statements like this. So let me point out that this is not some kind of God of the gaps argument, since we cannot explain it by natural law. God must have done it. This is a positive case for God. Well, it's not. It's a God of the gaps argument. And in order to get around this, Turek keeps having to find different ways to play word games and phrase stuff that it just kind of sounds like he's not making a God of the gaps argument. For example, he has a whole chapter on DNA, genetics, and information as evidence for God. So he talks about DNA, he references this author. In Signature of the Cell, Dr. Meyer shows that the code expressed in DNA cannot be explained naturally and provides positive evidence for the prior activity of design and intelligence. I mean that sounds like God of the gaps, right? That's pretty straightforward, but Turek has to make this kind of roundabout explanation for how it's really not. And he describes it this way. He talks about the Rosetta Stone and the origin of the species, and he says, even though Dawkins and Schirmer didn't see anyone inscribe the Rosetta Stone or write the origin of species, they used their uniform experience in the past to discover that intelligence must have been the cause use their uniform experience in the present to discover that intelligence must have been the cause in the past. That's exactly what archaeologists and detectives do. When they discover inscriptions or crimes, it's not a gap in the knowledge about natural forces that led them to include intelligence was required. It's a positive knowledge that inscriptions require inscribers and crimes require criminals. So he's trying to make an analogy here, but the problem is we don't have any prior experience of the creation of DNA, the original synthesis of the human genome to compare it with. You could say it's a gap in our scientific knowledge, and Turek wants to put God in that gap. Which, yeah, it's God of the gaps with a fancy wrapper and analogy to try and confuse things a little bit. But the irony here is that Turek takes atheism to task for not having all the answers, but when flipped back around on his beliefs, he acknowledges that sometimes you don't have all the answers. He talks about the problem of evil, which comes up, which is a big area where theists struggle to provide answers for anything God does. He says that we need to admit that there are not easy or complete answers to every question. So it's okay when theists don't have all the answers, but when atheists don't have all the answers to certain questions, that is somehow a knock on their position and not on Turek's. Let's move on. Problem number 3. Hypotheses are not conclusions and common sense is not evidence. So we're talking about all these things that science doesn't have all the answers to just yet. And I empathize and I get why you want to have answers to those questions. And I get why theists want to say God is the answer, but that's not how science works. Science doesn't just take any old explanation that someone can come up with and just call it a day. That's called a hypothesis. And at some point you need to come up with actual support, evidence, data, experiments to support that hypothesis. But Turek just kind of stops at the hypothesis. When we're talking about origins of the universe, where science still doesn't have all the rock-solid explanation, Turek wants to put God in that space. He says there are good reasons for positing God. If time, space, and matter had a beginning, then the cause must transcend space, time, and matter. In other words, that cause must be spatialist, timeless, and immaterial. This cause must be enormously powerful to create the universe out of nothing. That's great. That is a good hypothesis. Now, how do we support that in any way? Turek doesn't do that. As we saw, he says he's making positive case to support his hypothesis, but he's just making fancy God of the gaps arguments. So what do you do when your hypothesis fails? Well, you just appeal to common sense. For example, he's talking about reason once again. He says, I think the best explanation begins with a philosophical theory called realism. Realism is a common sense belief that there is a reality external to our minds, and that includes material and immaterial things. So we're saying the immaterial things, they just obviously exist. And he includes things like logic, math, hypothetical concepts in the immaterial realm. And I think that atheists would agree that those things exist, but they reduce to material things, that is human brain. So do things exist that are immaterial but do not reduce to a human brain? Turek thinks so, and his evidence for this is, once again, common sense. And then listen to how he puts this. Now, materials break out in hives when you suggest that anything immaterial, like a soul, actually exists. They think you're advocating some kind of medieval superstition. No, theists are just advocating common sense. There really are immaterial realities that are intuitively obvious and that we use continuously, such as the laws of logic, the laws of mathematics, objective moral values, consciousness, and free will. But one doesn't lead to the other. You can acknowledge, just because math, logic, and so forth exist, that doesn't mean that souls exist. They're an entirely different thing. And if he wants to go with what common sense tells us as evidence, then common sense once told us that the sun revolves around the earth and that maggots and bugs spontaneously arise from rotting meat. And if, of course, eventually we learn through experimentation and data gathering that what was common sense is not actually reality. There's a difference, and you can't just rely on common sense to tell you the truth about reality. Problem number 4, objective and ultimate are all that matter. And we kind of touched on this earlier with the nihilism thing, but Turek hits on this point several times throughout the book. Once again, he says, no wonder atheism ultimately leads to despair. Life is meaningless, and no amount of temporal pleasure can cure that. And it's just nonsense. I mean, do you have family and friends that love you? Do you have hobbies that bring you joy? Do you advocate for causes that you find fulfilling? I mean, there's stuff in this life that can matter to you. Now, will it matter 5 billion years from now? Who cares? no one, even Christians, lives their life that way. I mean, they still have children, they still have jobs, they still have things they care about that aren't heaven. And I think it's kind of silly to suggest otherwise. I mean, it's good to have a larger perspective on things just so day-to-day reality doesn't get you down all the time. But I mean, thinking 5 billion years in the future all the time is probably a little bit too large of a perspective to have. I mean, if we were to follow Turek's logic where it leads, then all Christians should be living like the Apostle Paul, never getting married, not having kids, just preaching, trying to get as many people into heaven, if heaven is all that ultimately matters. So Turek talks about ultimate meaning, and he also has a lot of talk about ultimate objective morality. And he spends a whole chapter talking about the problems with subjective morality, but he never actually makes a case that objective morality is a thing. And you kind of need to do that too. I mean, like, I may wish that, I had a super cool flying solar powered car, and I could spend all day talking about that and talking about the problems with my shitty Hyundai, but push comes to shove, I don't actually have a flying car to get me to work. I have to work with the shitty car I do have. And if you want to talk about the problems with subjective morality, that's fine. But if that's all we have, it's all we have. So we kind of got to work with the framework that we have. And if Turek wants to put the Christian God forth as the objective source of morality, why do Christians disagree on so much about what morality is? I mean, you've had Christians on both sides of every major cultural and social change in the last 2 millennia, probably. I mean, you had Christians arguing that slavery was moral and fine, and slavery was immoral and should be abolished. And take that, but add civil rights and women's suffrage and temperance and gay rights and transgender issues. So if it's starting to sound awfully subjective when you're saying when your God is just supposed to be objective, is apparently telling people different things. And I don't know how you can have teetotaling Baptists and bikers who meet in literal bars worshiping the same God and supposedly getting their objective morality from the same God.